thank you so much for having me here. Today I will talk about the 5G deployment from a specific perspective, so the one of regulatory bodies, both national and EU, and their role in ensuring convergence and their challenging in doing so. I've already seen that many of my colleagues have spoke about 5G, so I will not repeat myself here. I just want to point out that 5G, as has been said, will allow more efficient use of network, asset, hardware, software, and spectrum. And as a result, is expected to enable new service and improving the existing one, like the clouds, in different sectors. So as a result, we will see that new service and the improvement of existing one will have a specific impact. And what was specific of electronic communication sector? So those technical and regulatory challenges that we have so far addressed only for what concerns the electronic communication sector will become more transversal, horizontal, and so each sector will have to deal with such challenges. I've tried to highlight the main ones from my perspective, and they relate to the public and private investment, the infrastructure and spectrum arrangement, traffic management, and here I'm thinking about net neutrality and the challenges relate to net neutrality and the definition of quality of service, security, privacy and data protection, and not to conclude, consumer protection. This is very important because, as I said, in each sector that will be invested by the novelties of 5G that can be fairly considered as enabler of cross-sector convergence, we will see that national and European bodies that so far have regulated and enforced the provision only about their own sector will have to deal about issues that have been broader, so relate also to other sectors. So the paper intends to analyze the role and the challenges of these bodies in this changing environment. To do so, I've tried to describe briefly, without putting too much emphasis on the genesis of national and EU regulatory bodies and what was originated. So the privatization process of essential state-owned assets occurred in the last 30 years have requested the allocation of task and responsibility to entities that were characterized for a high level of knowledge in their specific sector. This is why, because from a private perspective, these agencies that were the one that had to enforce and implement provision at national or European level was requested to have a technical knowledge and to address the specific issues that private sectors and private actors in implementing and enforcing EU sector specific norm in national networks had to address. And in particular, the central bodies have demonstrated, due to the fact, for example, of the short term and the difficulties in balancing different interests at national level between different organizations and issues, they were enabled to develop long-term strategies. This has created, in the time, the flourishing of these regulatory bodies, both at national but also at European level. In particular, at European level, we see that there are currently, I checked last day, 45 agencies and decentralized bodies across the EU territory, established in different domains and designed with different structures and responsibilities. They have the role to fill the gap between legislation, both national and European, and the concrete use case they have been displayed by the private sector, but also citizens. And we have seen this has been done quite successfully. In this specific moment, we have seen that the European Commission have tried to push a lot and to enforce different measures in order to flourish the digital single market. In order to create a digital single market, is fundamental for the European Union to create an environment where those regulatory bodies, EU and national, act as a kind of guardian, enforcing, implementing, and provide solution for those aspects that are not covered by the legislation. In particular, in the electronic communication sector, since this is the one where 5G network connectivity is originated, we see the role and increasing role of BEREC, the body of European regulators for electronic communications, that have been created almost 20 years ago. And we have seen that the European Electronic Communication Code, and more specifically the BEREC regulation, which complement the European Electronic Communication Code, has stressed, among other aspects, first of all, the role of BEREC as a sort of gatekeeper of all the policy that will interest the digital single market. And most important from my perspective on analysis, also the necessity to establish a concrete procedural mechanism that will ensure cooperation between different sectors and between different agencies, among others ENISA, but also ADPB, ADPS, and many others. Confirming this assumption that the digital single market and the BEREC office, with the support of the other national authorities, will have to deal and organize the whole structure of the digital single market in the different domain. In line with this, the BEREC regulations stress the importance of cooperation between competent union bodies, offices, agencies, and advisory groups, not only within the EU, but also outside within other international organizations. And this is very important. And we can see this also in the working arrangement that have been published recently, both for 2020 and 2001. BEREC has been assigned with this new task. Unfortunately, even if it's very promising, this first part of the article of the BEREC regulation, we see that it's complemented by the fact that such a cooperation, working arrangements, are subject to the approval of the European Commission and shall not create a legal obligation. In my opinion, this is detrimental for an efficient way of coordinate and develop procedural measures between the agency and between BEREC and national bodies. Because if we create a sort of judge about this arrangement, we don't give we do not create a legal obligation from these arrangements, there is a risk that they will not be efficient. In addition, one of the main elements of BEREC, and that has been stressed along the whole process of reform of the body, is the independence. If we create a sort of de facto approval by the European Commission as a crucial element for these working arrangements, the independence of BEREC, I think, is undermined. Another aspect that I wanted to display in my paper was security. This is why, because security has been considered as a precondition for the deployment of 5G network. And we have seen also that the recent action and initiative of the European Commission, and I'm referring, for example, to the request to ENISA to prepare cybersecurity certifications for process, service, and activities linked to 5G, is a sign that the European Commission considers security as a crucial element for the deployment of 5G, but also of the digital single market. For what concerns the communication context, we have seen that main provisions that deal with security are originated, in particular for this analysis, from the European Electronic Communication Code and from the NIS directive. Even if Article 41 of the European Electronic Communication Code foreseen differently from the Framework Directive the possibility to cooperate between agencies at national and European level, we have seen a lack of concrete measures in order to enforce such a cooperation. And this is, for me, detrimental, because will lead to different approach by different authorities in different member states. And this affects in particular those agencies and those entities that will be active at cross-border, so in different countries. This is the legal fragmentation is even more visible in the implementation of the NIS directive. In fact, while electronic communication service providers should have been excluded, and seems to me quite clear the Article 1, paragraph 3 of the NIS directive excludes such entities, we have seen that in the implementation of the NIS directive, these operators have been defined as operator of essential service by many member states. As a result,
Alessandro, 2 more minutes.
Yeah, as a result, we see inconsistency in the application of such measures. In fact, the European Commission reporting on the NIS directive application have noticed that there are currently member states that are using cross-border consultation procedure due to the different level of implementation of the NIS directive. And this has created a lot of problem from a business perspective. A potential solution may be represented by the cooperation group, but so far this group has no procedural or enforcement power. To conclude, the novelties brought by the 5G network will affect multiple sectors, enhancing sector coupling, and will interest a different regulatory convergence as a result of this technical convergence. Unfortunately, none of the legislative initiatives produced so far at EU level in the electronic communication context ensure coordination among the regulatory bodies. So my suggestion is that EU institutions start developing legal measures to ensure effective cooperation between EU agencies. Member states will try to implement in coordination among themselves such cooperation within their own country. As a result, we might see a proper support from these regulatory bodies for the rollout of the 5th generation of mobile networks. Thank you.
Alessandro, thank you very much for the paper. I've read it, and while I come from I have a background in telecoms regulation, I'm not an expert on cybersecurity, so it's like it was an opportunity for me also to catch up with this part of telecoms a little bit. Having said that, I have some comments about the paper. Yes, in terms of structure and content, because I'm not convinced by a few of the things that, as you will see, I will explain. So when it comes to the title of the paper, it says 5G deployment, the role and challenges regulatory bodies in ensuring convergence with the EU. There's in the FSR Comms and Media, we are in regular contact with telecom operators. So I've heard from them that they are pretty much convinced that in case of 5G, there is a strong need, a strong case for a very much EU harmonized and driven approach to this technology. And from this perspective, definitely their collaboration between different authorities and bodies is of relevance for the 5G deployment. Now, when I was reading your paper, it was clear to me that you wanted to show that there is lack of procedural harmonization. But I have to admit, I had doubt whether it was lack of procedural harmonization in general or with respect to security. Because when it comes to 5G deployment, there are a number of very relevant issues where collaboration could enhance successful deployment. I think the one that comes to my mind as the first one is investment. Security definitely is one of them, but it's just one of many important issues. A part of your paper deals with security, but it comes only later on in the paper, whereas throughout most of your paper, you mention investment, consumer protection, but you focus on security really at the end. So I was a bit kind of hesitant about understanding, is the security the main issue to show lack of procedural harmonization? Or if it's not, then I was missing that kind of discussion also with respect to other aspects. Having said that, I was wondering how various parts of the paper actually help you demonstrate lack of this harmonization. Personally, I found various parts of the paper very descriptive, and these are one of the sections, for instance, section 1.1.2 on regulatory challenges of 5G network. How do they link to the main goal of your paper? I'm not convinced, as I find the discussion extremely general on a very abstract level and not specifically with respect to 5G. I think that if you focus on 5G, you should explain how do 5G differ from previous technologies. I think institutional collaboration is not technology specific. So there were needs for collaboration also with respect to 4G, 3G, and so on, but also in the fixed sector. So I think that if the focus is on 5G, you have to explain how is it different. Are there any issues that are specific to that didn't exist before? Or if they existed before, it's like what kind of collaboration has been already in place. So now during your talk, I understood that security is not the main focus of the paper. It's just one of the examples. So suggestions for improvement that I have included, I prepared them having in mind that security was actually one of the issues. If it was the case, of course, I would have moved the part on security much earlier on in the paper. It comes only towards the end. Then when it comes to novelties and challenges brought by 5G, I would have gone more in depth about that. So for instance, you mentioned network slicing, but there are issues like concerning spectrum, densification. You mentioned during your presentation also infrastructure sharing, to which competition authorities would be very suspicious. And there you could also have security problems. Again, ENISA is mentioned only on page 8, but these are all comments as I said, I have prepared having in mind the security as the main topic. If it's not, as I said, I think the paper would have benefited from having also another issue like investment, having discussed with respect to collaboration. And another comment concerns, I think, a selective reference to various provisions. So for instance, you refer to Article 11 of the EC code, of the new Electronic Communications Code, but this is entitled 2 on institutions and governance. It's a very general, provision. There are many other provisions that actually show that there is collaboration and cooperation between regulatory authorities at the national level, as well as the European Commission and national authorities. So I think that if you want to advance the argument that there is lack of procedural harmonization in which fields, if you choose security, then you could compare with the areas where such collaboration exists. And here I provided a number of provisions that show intense and I think long established cooperation, specifically Article 32 and 33, which are ex-Article 7 and 7a on the notification procedure. There has been cooperation established for years on remedies, on the procedure for the consistent application of remedies. So such collaboration exists here. If it doesn't exist anywhere, compare and show how, because I think that personally, I find that half of your paper is very general. It doesn't link to the topic to the title of the paper at all. And this comes at the expense that you do not go deep enough in parts where it could have been useful to advance the theory, the right theory that more collaboration is needed for the successful deployment of 5G. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anna. There are so far no other questions. So Alessandro, you get to react.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the feedback. It's great to have this kind of feedback, and I think if I can use later, will be really useful. About the topic, my idea, and I don't know if I reached the goal, and probably not, was to show and to explain organizational and also a kind of substantial topic where I think are the precondition in order to talk then about other aspects of the 5G rollout. So from an organizational point of view with BEREC, and with the security point of view, showing the inconsistency and the lack of, and the problem in the implementation. So since regulatory agencies are the ones that are supposed to fill the gap between legislation and real case and the business request, and also control the business and enforce the provision, was a clear example of how we can see if there is cooperation or not, since we have seen consistency in the implementation. So the different agencies have acted in a different way. I was also considering when I started drafting this paper, other aspects like the one related to consumer protection, where I think we can talk a lot, because there are a lot of implications related to the fact that European Electronic Communication Code exclude from the scope of application for what concerns consumer provision, for example, M2M providers, and this was also something that I was considering. And I agree with you, and this is something that was raised also by some colleague I work with, about to differentiate and explain more the difference, how is different 5G respect others, and this is something that I will take into account. I also consider to talk about more about ENISA and other entities in particular, but I was afraid to go out of the scope of the paper in the sense of talking, for example, when it comes to a security incident that will affect the network, will have a result also in a potential data breach, which will determine the involvement also of the privacy, the data protection authority. So the necessity to coordinate between telecommunication authorities and privacy authority. I wanted to be, maybe I feel in being too high level, but I want to try to not focus only on one aspect, because as I said at the beginning, there are main legal issues, also the one related to network neutrality and the different sector that might be interested by the development of net neutrality in the 5G context. But this is what I wanted to say. And this is why I focus on BEREC, because in my opinion was organization. So to set the floor for then, and since the BEREC regulation, in my opinion, gives to BEREC the role of gatekeeper, and then to focus on one of the sectors that I have illustrated in one of the first slides that's more interesting. The idea was not to focus only on security, but was a clear example where the implementation and enforcement, where the role of regulatory bodies is more important, was more evident the difficulties and the lack of implementation and harmonization of measures.
Okay, thanks. Anna, you wanted to add something, or I don't have any other questions?
I could add two points on, it's always related to security. When you refer to lack of standard protocol for internal collaboration procedures within the same country, I actually looked into that and I asked myself, because as I said, I'm not an expert on cybersecurity, is that the number of teams within each country differ. So for instance, I saw Ireland only had 3 teams, whereas Spain had 53. But also the type of constituency is there is a huge divergence. I think that the list included 23, but some were doubled. But in any case, there were like over 15 different type of constituencies, from commercial to military to governmental. And I think that this could explain the difficulty in having an internal, a standard protocol for all the countries, if a country is independent in deciding what kind of teams it wants to have and constituencies, right? If the EU doesn't decide that this is something that has to be standardized across all the member states, then I believe that lack of a standard protocol is simply allowing the countries to experiment with what is the most adequate solution for their specific, for their country-specific situation. That's one. And the second is that with respect to their electromagnetic fields, I've read that there are countries that have very stringent limits on electromagnetic fields, and this can actually significantly hamper the deployment of 5G in some countries. And one of them is Italy, I think, and certainly Poland. In November 2019, there was a public consultation on the draft regulation on permissible levels of electromagnetic fields in the environment. And from what I understood, I don't know whether it was passed or not, but if it is, it could be a game changer in the countries where these strict levels exist. And I think this is the kind of harmonization at the EU level that could be used to show how harmonization can advance successful deployment of 5G.
Alessandro, just before I want to add, and then you can conclude, but it seems to me that your use of the word convergence is not the same that we are using here, because it's basically about harmonization and coordination and, you know, sort of, is that correct?
My assumption was a result of convergence that I believe will be enhanced thanks to 5G network connectivity. So is a result, and in order to make concrete and to develop legislative initiatives to support such a convergence, is necessary to have an increasing level of harmonization of procedure.
Okay, yeah.
At central level, but also at the regulatory level. And to add what Anna was saying, I've also, in doing research in this field, seen that, for example, for what concerns the XIRT, we have different level, and in some countries we have different numbers of CIRT, some, for example, only for digital service providers, some only for operator of essential service. What I have noticed as interesting as a role of backbone of this digital revolution is that electronic communication service provider have been considered by some countries as a digital infrastructure provider. So they are kind of changing their business model. And the fact that they will deploy 5G will be interesting to see if maybe was not better to have a different approach in the context of NIS directive and to stop considering telecom operator as only electronic communication service provider and more as digital infrastructure provider.